Hello and welcome to Kentucky Case Files, a true crime podcast where we dive deep into Kentucky-based true crime stories, both infamous and overlooked. I'm Emily Steele.
And I'm Marcus Roland, and this is part 2 of a Clay Shrout case entitled Guilty but Mentally Ill. Now, we talked a little bit about what was going on right after Clay's arrest the last time. Now, once Clay was arraigned, Tom Willenborg, the attorney I worked for, was assigned as his, what they call a guardian ad litem. Now, you hear about guardian ad litems a lot in, for instance, adoption cases or child custody cases or some situation, usually a familial type legal environment where a child needs some type of special representation. And since Clay's parents were dead, that was indeed Clay's situation. He needed someone to serve in place of his parents and look out for his personal interests. And then there would be another attorney, Ed Drennan, who looked out for his legal interests. So Tom served as the GAL, as they called it, and Ed Drennan was his lead attorney in the juvenile proceedings. Now, it's interesting to note that if Shrout had been tried as a juvenile, he would have only been held in jail until he reached the age of 19. There were multiple hearings leading up to the court's decision on whether he should be tried as an adult, and I actually got to fill in for Tom for one of them. I just was there briefly for a hearing. It wasn't a very long hearing. It wasn't the hearing to determine if he should be held as an adult. But I remember two very specific things. Clay was wearing a black suit, and he had a Looney Tunes tie. And I remember talking to his attorney, Ed, at the time, and Ed said he had picked the tie out, and there was no more discussion of that. But I only assumed that was a twofold decision on Ed Drennan's part to portray his youthfulness with a cartoon tie. And then the whole, I might be reaching for it here, the whole Looney Tunes. Is there going to be a mental defense
Is
here?
he Looney Tunes?
Yeah. And there was a form of mental defense that actually came out in the case, a mental illness defense.
Boone County District Court Judge Charles Moore eventually ruled Shrout should be tried as an adult. As an adult, he would be eligible for the death penalty. But the case never went to trial because on September 9th, 1994, Boone County Commonwealth Attorney Willie Mathis proposed a plea of guilty but mentally ill.
Now, earlier in the proceedings, I actually remember Tom recommending that exact plea to Ed Drennan. I remember Tom talking about it, that he had written it on a piece of paper and slid it over to Ed, and that's what it ended up being.
Now, Mathis indicated that the agreement was struck based on a request by Shrout's grandparents.
The remaining immediate family of Clay Shrout, including both sets of grandparents and his uncles, who are the most affected victims of this act, have asked us to seek an alternative which would not include the death penalty and would include long-term mental health.
The agreement called for Clay to receive mental health treatment while in prison, but the agreement did not and could not require him to participate in such treatment.
During the hearing, when Shrout entered his plea, he showed very little emotion in response to Judge Bamberger, the Boone County Circuit Judge. Clay acknowledged to Bamberger that he was aware he was waiving his constitutional rights to a trial by jury, and in response to his plea regarding each of the murder counts, he said guilty but mentally ill. Shrout was then transferred to the Johnson Breckenridge Treatment Center, a Louisville, Kentucky juvenile detention center.
When Shrout turned 18, Judge Bamberger resentenced him as an adult, and Clay was transferred to the Kentucky State Reformatory near LaGrange, Kentucky, a medium security facility. At the resentencing hearing, Bamberger told Shrout, as you spend every day, as you spend every week, as you spend every month, as you spend every year of those 25 years, I hope that you think of your parents and your sisters. Bamberger also commented that, quote, there is no justification, there is no mitigation, there is no excuse. least the 25 years following his sentencing, Clay's life would be a strictly routinized and lonely one. He would no longer be referred to as Clay Shrout, but rather prisoner 119453. And he apparently did not care about establishing himself as a model prisoner in hopes of garnering favorable treatment at his first parole hearing that would take place in 2019.
Clay would be quite the troublemaker. Over several years, he would rack up 29 pages of infractions. 5 years into his sentence, he had become known as a disciplinary problem. He had violated prison rules, planned an escape, and was a frequent resident of solitary confinement. He also refused to participate in the prison's mental health programs, and as you referenced earlier, he wasn't required to do that as part of his actual plea. Now, when Clay arrived at the Kentucky State Reformatory in LaGrange, Kentucky, a minimum and medium risk prison, he seemed to acclimate, but soon the guards found he had stuffed cigarette butts in his bedpost. That doesn't sound like a big deal,
No.
really, but it had to do with keeping your cells tidy and things of that nature. I guess a more regimented military almost protocol for keeping your cells in proper order. He just got 40 extra hours of work for violating that particular rule. But shortly after that infraction, he was caught with a blanket he stole from the prison infirmary. He was then sent to the segregation unit for 45 days. A little tougher sentence on that one.
When he was caught in another cell after the visiting curfew, he was sent back to solitary confinement for 15 days. In between the stints of solitary confinement, he took an electrical class and worked in food service part-time. He eventually got on a waiting list for an upholstery class, but before he could get in, he went back to solitary when officers found a 10-inch bar hidden in his cell. Clay said he found the bar in the prison yard, so into solitary he went, this time for 105 days. Prison officials believed the bar was tied to an escape planned by Shrout and 2 other inmates. Officers found a pair of razor wire resistant gloves in a closet near a cell close by to one of the inmates. Officers also found a letter talking about the plan. That would be the end of Clay's tenure at the LaGrange facility. He was then transferred to the Big House, the most restrictive maximum security prison facility in Eddyville, Kentucky, which also houses Kentucky's death row and the electric chair. While death by execution did not await Clay given his sentence, he did little to be a model prisoner.
Now, Eddyville didn't really send a message to Clay because he wound up in solitary there in 1997 after cutting in the canteen line. Another thing that you wouldn't think would be a big deal, kind of like the cigarette butts. But that was considered a serious infraction because such an act could wreak havoc among the other prisoners. And the result of that infraction was 15 days in solitary, which at Eddyville is considered a jail within a jail. Now, Warden Barry Bannister at Eddyville called solitary the end of the line in Kentucky. The amenities consisted of shaved heads, yellow scrubs, and flip-flops instead of the prisoner's own clothes. No TV, no phone. Meals would arrive through a slot in the door, and there was no contact with anyone for 23 hours, with the remaining hour walking outside the cell in shackles and cuffs. Residents would get outside exercise 1 hour per week. Now, later that same year, he wound up in solitary for 11 months when guards found a knife in his cell.
That seemed to get Clay's attention, and he managed to behave thereafter when he was allowed to return to the general population and stay there, seemingly accepting his situation. Years later, he was transferred to the Green River Correctional Complex, a medium security prison where he remains today. Shrout has learned carpentry and car repair and has helped other inmates complete their GEDs. He hasn't had any disciplinary issues in prison since 2002. He said he has since become a Christian. In March of 2019, 25 years after the killings, Shrout went before the Kentucky Parole Board for his first parole hearing. The 2-member panel who first met with Shrout oddly could not reach a unified decision. Therefore, Kentucky law required that all 9 members of the board must convene a hearing and vote.
it's something that I can't undo. It's something that I can't take back. And they're dead, and they're not going to be undead. They're not going to stop being dead. And it doesn't matter how bad I feel about it now. It doesn't matter what I would change now. They're not going to stop being dead. They're dead, and that's the end of it.
Do you think you deserve to be paroled?
I don't think I deserve to be alive. I hate what's happened, and I hate the way my life has turned out. And I mean, it started out bad, and then it got worse. And I'm the one that made it worse. And you know, you break some things, and you can't fix it. There's nothing you can do to make it better. There's nothing you can do to put it back together again. Do I feel I'm a threat to the community? No. Do I feel I'm going to commit a crime or be in danger of committing a crime? No, I don't.
Shrout told the panel that he never sought any mental health, behavioral, or substance abuse counseling in prison beyond one visit with a psychologist. While he saw a therapist when he was a child, he claimed it did no good. The experience of my life has been that anytime there's a problem, if it needs to be fixed, I've got to figure out a way to fix it on my own. Then Shrout recounted what happened on May 26, 1994.
Well, what I did was I killed 4 human beings, and I took about 20-something more hostage. I got my father's gun out of his car. He kept one in his glove box. I got my brother's gun out of his car. I went to sleep that night. I woke up the next morning, and I murdered my mother, and I murdered my father, and I murdered my 2 sisters. And after that, I went to school with the intention of drawing the police out to have the police shoot me and kill me. In the frame of mind I was in at the time, things made sense to me then that wouldn't have made sense several days later. And what was going through my head, though it is not really rational.
But there are different stories that have been told as to why he went to school and what he actually did, which is, I find, curious. He went there looking for the teacher and the principal
To continue the killing.
Then he rather peacefully surrendered. And he says here he went there for basically suicide by cop type of situation. I just find that interesting that his stories or the actual events and his stories as to why he went there aren't very consistent, which why would
it's interesting. It's not surprising given the years he had to reflect on things. And what it makes me wonder is whether he genuinely gained insight that was not available to him at the time that he committed the murders, or whether he has had time to manufacture a convenient story, because they're possible. It's possible that with time and distance, he was able to understand his actions differently, his motivations differently, but it's also possible that he thought that would be a more compelling story for the parole board.
Yeah. And that just goes to the manipulative nature of someone who would be considered a psychopath. Dr. Langman we'll talk about later. And he also told them that if he were released, members of a Tennessee church who run an inmate program were willing to help him. Now, following the hearing, the full board denied parole and informed Shrout he will remain in prison for at least 10 more years before he is again eligible for parole. They stated that the seriousness of the crime, the involvement of the weapon, and the associated drug and alcohol abuse were all factors in their decision. I find that interesting because there was no evidence he was actually under the influence of any drugs or alcohol. But that could have just referred to his general tendencies of that. They did require Shrout to seek mental health and anger management counseling before his next parole hearing scheduled for May of 2029. Next on Kentucky Case Files, we will present Clay Shrout Part 3, Inside the Mind of a Psychopath, where we will talk to psychologist Dr. Peter Langman to try to find some answers as to why Clay Shrout did what he did. Sourcing for this podcast came from the Cincinnati Post, the Kentucky Post, the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Courier-Journal, and the Lexington Herald-Leader, which covered the killings widely and was our primary information source, along with Peter Langman's February 2016 article, Clay Shrout, and analysis, which can be found at www.schoolshooters.info. Media clips were obtained from WLWT Channel 5 and WXIX Fox 19 in Cincinnati. Additional interviews have supplemented our reporting.